Good afternoon and welcome to It's Your Smarter Money with Dr. Laura and Professor Steve. Today, talking about bonds. We've talked about bonds before. We've talked about bonds. We had a chapter 1 and a chapter 2, and we talked about bonds in general and how they work. And today we want to focus on one particular type of bond that we like and have used quite a bit in our clients' portfolios, and that is municipal bonds.
Yep. So we'd shown this slide in a last presentation, I think. It's just sort of a summary of the types of bonds. We just are showing it again here just to sort of show you where municipal bonds fit in on the flow chart of bonds. And so they're on the left side. Mostly they're non-taxable, or there are taxable municipal bonds, but we're not talking about those here. We're talking about non-taxable bonds. And by the way, with non-taxable municipal bonds, they can be non-taxable on the federal level, but they could be taxed by your state. So for example, if you buy a Texas bond and you live in New Jersey may still tax the income on that Texas bond. So for it to be double non-taxable, which is what they say, single or double non-taxable, you'd have to buy a New Jersey bond. And it would be non-taxable both on the federal level and on the state level. So, Laura, maybe you want to cover some of the characteristics of municipals here?
Well, sure. I guess the primary thing around municipal bonds is, are they general obligation bonds, which are backed by the taxes that the municipality collects and therefore are somewhat guaranteed by the municipality or the jurisdiction, or are they revenue bonds? And revenue bonds are based upon some type of project that is being launched and they're collecting. You might get a New Jersey Parkway bond where now it's backed by the revenue of the New Jersey Parkway's ability to collect revenue. And with the New Jersey Parkway, I think I wouldn't mind having that revenue bond,
no.
But there are other revenue bonds because that they're
stadiums, for example.
Right, which
or
have
housing
not
projects
done well.
Yes.
And so not all municipal bonds are considered safe, that some are safer than others. And one element is this idea of, is it a general obligation bond or is it a revenue bond? And what we've seen is that amongst the bonds that defaults, first of all, municipalities in general have a lot lower default rate than corporate bonds.
Minuscule.
And then when you look at the general obligation bonds versus the revenue bonds, it's usually the revenue bonds that will default, if anything. Usually it's not a whole municipality that has defaulted, although it has happened before.
It has happened. Oh, there was Orange County years ago in California, I think. And I think there was a town in Pennsylvania, it might have been Harrisburg. They had a problem with some bonds, I would say within the last 10 years. But it is quite rare, especially if you buy municipals rated A or higher. And some municipals actually do have some insurance on it. We're not going to talk about that here, but it does provide an added layer of protection. And there's also some municipals that are pre-refunded. Something else that we're not going to talk about here, but it does add another layer of safety to the municipal.
Well, and when you're using investment professionals to help you pick the bonds that are going to go in your portfolio, you want to know what their position is on investable grade types of investments. I mean, all of you probably that are watching here know Steve and I, and know that we are really, really conservative in terms of the way we like to invest. And we look for investment grade types of securities always. We are looking for, if we're going to purchase a bond, we want to know, what is the balance sheet of this this entity? There are places that we would probably stay away from and not purchase.
And by the way, we're seeing, I think some advisors take more and more risk of late, and also mutual funds and ETFs, because yields are so terrible right now. And so the only way you can really increase yield is really only two ways. First, you go out longer on the yield curve, And secondly, lower the quality of the bond, because bonds of lower quality and rating generally have to pay more. The interest rate has to be higher on his bonds.
And we keep talking about this. What is the role of a bond in your portfolio? The role of the bond in your portfolio is to be there for you no matter what. And so to buy you a bunch of bonds that we know in a 2008 type of environment, it could potentially blow up. It to us doesn't make any sense. We want to adhere to the whole purpose of why we are holding a bond in your portfolio to begin with. If not, we might as well just buy you stocks or something else.
Yep. And so here's a table showing you the default rate. And this is, by the way, one of the reasons why we generally don't use corporates. And sometimes when you look at something like this, you could be fooled a bit, because you could say, gee, AAA corporates had a pretty low default rate, but that's AAA corporates. It's very rare for AAA corporate to actually go into default. What's more likely to happen is for the credit rating agencies to gradually reduce the rating of that bond. So suddenly the AAA gradually becomes a AA, then an A, and then a BBB. And it could take a couple of years, and finally it could actually default. And so that is not exactly entirely, I would say, reflective of what can actually happen. There's a time factor here.
And Steve, we had this whole conversation yesterday at the investment committee meeting where we were talking about, we were actually looking at the yield curves of the treasury bonds and the municipal bonds and the corporate bonds, corporate AAA and corporate BBB. And when we looked at it, we were actually talking about, should we actually go for that higher yield in the AAA?
Yeah. And
the delta was just so minuscule. We said, well, really, why are we going to take on that additional risk for just a teeny tiny additional return? It just doesn't seem worth it.
Was it about 0.5% a year?
Oh,
roughly,
yeah.
For 10 years per year?
Yeah. It was, I think even less than 0.5%. It might have been like 40 basis points.
Yeah.
The place where there was a large delta was in the double Bs. But again, that's just, they're distressed companies. That's why they're being forced to pay that higher yields. And the minute you see distressed companies, are you sure you want to be investing in distressed companies in this particular space that you're looking for stability?
And there's a couple of reasons, by the way. One other risk I want to mention here, it's not just default risk. When the bond of a company or entity is downgraded, the value of the bond drops. And so if you want to sell that bond because you're concerned about its lowered rating, now suddenly you're going to get less money for that bond because it was downgraded. And the other risk, which is not really shown here, is something we've talked about a lot in the past. And that's what happens to corporates and lower rated bonds if we experience a really bad economic panic or an issue like we had a year ago with COVID. You'll see the value of those bonds drop like the company stock. And so that's another risk that's not really shown here, by the way.
Yes.
And so how do we decide whether you should have municipals in your portfolio? Well, a big part of it boils down to tax rate and what marginal tax bracket you're in. And there's an equation called tax equivalent yield. And this is how we make this decision. We take the municipal bond yield, argument's sake right now on the 10-year, it's about 1%, believe it or not. We divide that by 1 minus your marginal tax rate. So if you're in a 30% marginal bracket, I need a calculator to calculate it. I should have put an example here, but anyway, we deduct 0.7 from 1, and I'm sorry, 0.3 from 1, and in effect, we're dividing the municipal bond yield by 0.7. And so in other words, I'm going to use my calculator here. That's 1 divided by 0.7. And we'll have the taxable equivalent yield in a minute. 1 divided by 0.7. And that taxable equivalent yield is 1.4%. So in other words, on a taxable bond, you would have to have a yield of better than 1.4% to have a better yield than you would net on that municipal bond after taxes. And it gets a little more complicated when you throw in state income tax. We've left it out of this equation just for simplicity.
But this is one of the reasons why we ask all of you to give us your tax returns. And we really want to understand what is going on with your taxes, not just last year, but
Mhm.
and also in the future. So if you come to us and you say, I'm going to be, I'm in a high tax bracket, but I'm going to be retiring next year. Well, we even want to know, okay, are you going to be taking, is there going to be a pension involved?
Right.
What else is going on in terms of your life, so that we can make a decision on whether a municipal bond makes sense for you. Because if we buy a municipal bond this year, that makes sense this year, and you're no longer in a high bracket next year, well, maybe we shouldn't have bought it.
Yep.
There's always an opportunity potentially to sell it. But we need to know that. We need to know that your tax situation has changed. And
That's right.
so that's why we ask you these questions.
And that's why we try to project as best we can. Of course, it's always an estimate. What your tax, what marginal bracket you're going to be in over the next few years. We try to project it as much as we can. Of course, it's never perfect, but gives us a better idea regarding how we should structure your bond portfolio.
So I think that's the last slide, right?
Yes, it is.
But so municipal bonds are definitely a vehicle that are worth looking at. Again, it depends what situation you're in. Even in the taxable municipal bond arena, they have sometimes made sense as well.
Yes.
And it depends. We want to know, where are we putting the bonds? Because if we're putting bonds in a qualified account, in an IRA or a Roth IRA, municipals are not going to give us the value that we're looking for. So we would only put a taxable municipal in that arena. But so asset location becomes very, very important. But they are definitely something that folks should look at and consider. And we do when we're comparing the different types of bonds that we're going to be purchasing for you.
And I just want to mention, this is this bond series will also be continuing. We have a lot more pieces of it, I think, going down the line. I think the next one we're going to be talking about how bonds are valued, and we'll be talking about some of the alternative bonds we use going down the line, and probably some more complex issues related to bonds, including something called duration and also convexity.
So thank you. Again, if you have further questions that you'd like to discuss with us, please feel free to give us a call, send us an email. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks. Bye.